September 9, 1943, as the Allies invade mainland Italy at Cerno, they have an unlikely hero on their side, HMS Nelson, an eccentric, accident-prone British battleship from the 1920s, a floating relic of a short-lived class, built 2 decades earlier. Yet still capable of changing the course of battle despite her age, she is about to unleash one of her most unusual features against the enemy, as thousands of Allied troops leap from their landing craft and charge across the beaches. A storm of German fire rains down on them from the entrenched 16th Panzer Division, which threatens to halt the invasion in its tracks, but Nelson's unconventional design gives her an extraordinary advantage. All her main guns are mounted forward, allowing her to face the enemy head-on. She unleashes a devastating barrage of 16-inch shells from her 9 great cannons, the thunder of her guns shaking the coast and blasting apart German positions. She clears a path through which the Allies can push deeper into Italy, pressing forward with their mission of liberation and drawing closer to eventual victory in the war. This remarkable firepower comes from a design that was initially born out of necessity, rather than bold creativity following the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty, which imposed strict limits on the size and armament of battleships. Nelson and her sister ship Rodney were conceived under challenging restrictions with a maximum displacement of 35,000 tons. The designers realized that placing all 3 triple-gun turrets forward would shorten the armored citadel and reduce weight without forcing them to compromise on weaponry or armor. This unusual layout allowed them to fit thicker protection along the belt deck turrets and conning tower while still maintaining firepower equal to that of larger ships. Yet this radical decision drew sharp criticism at the time. Traditionalists claimed that concentrating the armament in the bow made the ship dangerously vulnerable if her forward section were disabled, and left her unable to fire astern without turning her entire hull. But supporters of the design argued that in most real combat scenarios Nelson would benefit from being able to engage an opponent directly ahead and could do so without exposing her broadside, which would keep her target profile smaller and potentially safer. In a gun duel measuring nearly 710 feet in length and carrying a crew of more than 1,300 officers and sailors, Nelson represented both innovation and compromise when she was launched in September 1925. After nearly 2 years of trials, she officially entered service in August 1927 and soon became the flagship of first the Atlantic Fleet and later the Home Fleet. Her early career, however, was marked by embarrassing mishaps. In March 1931, while navigating through thick fog off Cape Galano, Spain, she nearly collided head-on with the SS West Wales, but the 2 ships only scraped hulls sideways and suffered minor damage. Then, in January 1934, just minutes after leaving Portsmouth for a spring cruise in the West Indies with the Home Fleet, a tremor shook the ship as she ran aground on a shallow patch known as Hamilton Shoal. Her high center of gravity, created by her relatively short hull, combined with the forward weight of her turrets, made her more difficult to handle, especially at low speeds. This time she was lucky again. After lightening her load, she floated free with the next high tide and continued on her mission when World War II erupted. Nelson entered a far more dangerous chapter of her career. The North Sea quickly became one of the most perilous places on Earth, patrolled by German U-boats hunting for British warships. On October 30, 1939, Nelson narrowly avoided destruction when the submarine U-56 crept within just 870 yards and launched 3 torpedoes, 2 of which struck her but failed to detonate due to faulty detonators. Had they exploded, Nelson would almost certainly have been lost, but instead she sailed on shaken but alive, though her crew now knew they would face constant threats from beneath the waves with U-boat activity intensifying around the British Isles. Every mission into contested waters was a gamble. Every sighting of a periscope a reminder of how vulnerable even a massive battleship could be. Yet Nelson's survival, time and again, would soon cement her reputation as both unlucky in her mishaps and extraordinarily lucky in her escapes. She sailed straight into a deadly trap laid by the German submarine U-31 and struck a powerful magnetic mine hidden beneath the waves. The force of the detonation was catastrophic, tearing open a 10-foot gash in her steel hull and sending a violent shockwave through the ship that knocked sailors from their feet and filled compartments with smoke and seawater. 74 crewmen were injured in the blast, and massive flooding spread quickly through the lower decks as damage control parties scrambled to contain the disaster. For a time, it seemed that Nelson might not survive, but her watertight bulkheads held, and she managed to limp back toward safety. The crippled battleship was eventually brought to Portsmouth, where she was taken into dock for extensive repairs. For 8 long months, welders, engineers, and shipwrights labored to restore her strength, cutting away twisted plating, sealing ruptured compartments, and reinforcing her hull so that she could return to service. By August 1940, Nelson was ready to fight again. Her scars patched, though not forgotten. Alongside her sister Rodney, she steamed north to Rosyth, near Edinburgh, tasked with guarding the east coast of Scotland against the ever-present threat of German invasion. The shadow of Operation Sea Lion loomed over Britain, and Nelson's heavy guns stood ready to repel any hostile landing. Soon after, she shifted to patrol the stormy waters between the Faroe Islands and Iceland, where German surface raiders and U-boats prowled in search of Allied convoys. These patrols were long, cold, and monotonous, but the danger was real. Any lapse in vigilance could mean torpedoes in the water, or a raider slipping through to prey on merchantmen. Yet even as Nelson carried out her duty, she was already beginning to show her age. By the end of 1940, the Royal Navy's new King George V class was entering service. These sleek modern battleships were faster, more versatile, and more resilient against torpedoes and mines. They boasted advanced radar and fire control systems that allowed them to detect enemies beyond the horizon and direct their salvos with deadly accuracy. Compared to them, Nelson and Rodney looked like relics of a previous era, cumbersome and unconventional, their forward-mounted turrets a symbol of compromise rather than innovation. But if she was outdated, Nelson was still dangerous. 9 great 16-inch guns concentrated forward gave her a fearsome punch in a head-on fight, and her thick armor could still shrug off heavy punishment. She narrowly missed taking part in one of the most famous naval battles of the war, the Hunt for the Bismarck in May 1941. Ordered to join the chase, Nelson steamed hard but arrived too late. The German giant already battered and sunk by other British units. Frustrated at missing the glory, her crew soon found consolation in another mission, intercepting a German supply ship. When the enemy vessel sighted Nelson's massive silhouette on the horizon, her crew knew resistance was futile. Rather than be annihilated by broadsides from the battleship, they scuttled their own ship, detonating charges and slipping over the side as their vessel went down in flames. It was a bloodless victory, but it underscored Nelson's ability to inspire fear by her mere presence. By mid-1941, Nelson was sent south into the Mediterranean, a theater of constant danger where air power, submarines and surface raiders clashed daily over the vital lifeline to Malta. She was tasked with escorting troopships and convoys through seas infested with Axis aircraft and torpedo boats. As part of Force H, Nelson became the flagship of Vice Admiral James Somerville, her bridge serving as the nerve center of daring operations. In August, during a carefully staged deception, Somerville temporarily transferred his flag to Rodney, while Nelson and her destroyers turned west, creating the illusion of withdrawal. Under cover of darkness, Nelson wheeled back, cutting through calm seas to rejoin a second convoy bound for Malta. At dawn, Italian reconnaissance planes spotted the British ships, and soon swarms of enemy bombers descended. The sky erupted in smoke, tracer fire, and the screaming roar of diving aircraft. Nelson's gunners blazed away at incoming torpedo bombers, while Fulmar fighters from the convoy darted through the melee. Amid the chaos, 3 Italian SM-84s broke through the screen and released their torpedoes. Nelson swung desperately to evade, but, at just 450 yards, one struck home. The explosion tore a gaping 30-by-15-foot wound in her bow, obliterating the torpedo compartment and flooding forward spaces. The ship shuddered violently, but her crew fought to keep her afloat, reducing speed to 12 knots to ease pressure on her battered bulkheads, determined not to betray her damage to the enemy. Nelson pressed on, her guns still manned, as the convoy staggered through to Malta. Only afterward did she limp back to Gibraltar for emergency repairs before heading to Rosyth. For a more thorough refit, by May 1942, Nelson was back in action. She escorted convoys down the west coast of Africa, before returning to the Mediterranean to take part in the epic Operation Pedestal, another desperate bid to supply Malta. As flagship of Vice Admiral Edward Sifrit, she led a fleet into a storm of danger. German and Italian forces hurled everything they had at the convoy. Bombers swooped in waves. U-boats lurked beneath the surface. Motor torpedo boats darted in from the shadows, and minefields threatened to shred the fleet. Dozens of Allied ships were lost, but Nelson, battered though she was, managed to fight through without taking a single hit, her luck holding once again. By 1943, the Mediterranean balance was shifting. Italy's navy was weakened, her armies demoralized, and public support for Mussolini collapsing. In June, the Allies struck at Sicily, launching Operation Husky. Nelson joined the covering naval forces patrolling the Ionian Sea, ensuring that the remnants of the Italian fleet could not interfere with the landings. From the deck, the crew could see the glow of distant bombardments as Allied troops fought their way inland. Nelson's presence was a silent warning that any attempt to intervene would be met with overwhelming force. Within weeks, Mussolini was deposed, ousted on July 25 and replaced by Marshal Pietro Badoglio, marking the beginning of Italy's surrender and signaling yet another turning point in Nelson's long, eventful career. The Italian High Command, seeing a population tired of fighting what they viewed as Mussolini's war and concluding the Axis cause was doomed, opened secret channels to the Allies. Marshal Pietro Badoglio informed them of Italy's intention to abandon Hitler and switch sides. With German troops still occupying much of the mainland, the Allies planned their invasion carefully, and Nelson readied to play her part. On August 31, as General Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army prepared to cross from Sicily to Reggio Calabria, on the toe of Italy's boot, Nelson and Rodney unleashed the power of their 16-inch guns, bombarding coastal artillery to clear the way for amphibious landings set for September 3. Once a beachhead was secured, the two sisters steamed up the coast toward Salerno, where the main invasion was scheduled for the early hours of September 9. Nelson again provided a devastating shield of fire to suppress the 16th Panzer Division and reduce the threat to the assaulting Allied forces. Less than 3 weeks later, Nelson hosted the formal ratification of the armistice between Italy and the Allied powers, a moment marked by Marshal Badoglio's acceptance and Allied recognition on September 29. In June 1944, Nelson returned to European waters to support the largest seaborne invasion in history. Arriving off Gold Beach on June 11, she pounded German coastal defenses with massive 16-inch salvos, using the gun's long reach to strike bunkers, artillery emplacements, and other targets well inland, while Allied infantry stormed the shoreline. After completing her bombardment mission, she steamed back toward Portsmouth on June 18. But her knack for mishaps resurfaced. En route, she detonated to German mines, the first exploding to starboard, and the second beneath her forward hull, causing serious flooding and structural damage. Despite the severity of the hit, she survived long enough to reach port for temporary repairs and was later sent to the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard for more extensive work. With the war in Europe over in May 1945, Nelson was redeployed to the Far East, where the fight against Japan continued. She joined Britain's Eastern Fleet on July 9 and was selected as flagship by Vice Admiral H.T.C. Walker to help command Operation Livery, a series of naval airstrikes on Japanese positions in northern Malaya and southern Thailand, and to provide cover for minesweeping in the Strait of Malacca. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August brought Japan to surrender on September 2, and Nelson served as the venue for the surrender of Japanese forces in the Georgetown-Penang area shortly afterward. 10 days later, she was present for the formal surrender of all Japanese forces in Southeast Asia at Singapore. After the war, Nelson briefly resumed flagship duties with the home fleet before being converted into a training ship in 1947. Then placed in reserve and listed for disposal the following year. Before her final removal, she performed one last grim duty as a target ship during the summer of 1948, taking part in trials for 2,000-pound armor-piercing aerial bombs to assess their effectiveness. With that task complete, HMS Nelson arrived at Scotland on March 15, 1949, to begin demolition, bringing to a close a remarkable career that had seen her serve as a flagship around the globe and take part in some of the most significant naval operations of World War II.